Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. So today we are having a very interesting topic on democracy versus Lokatantra. Without delay, let us welcome Sri Kom Kapote. Good morning, good evening for you.
Good morning to you and good evening for me and namaskar to all. Greetings.
So, Kom, what is happening in the world? Because everyone is shouting democracy is in danger in United States, democracy in danger. Opposition is shouting democracy is in danger in India, and everywhere else people are shouting our democracy is hijacked by Americans. So what is happening? What is the status of democracy today?
I was reading the other day your book on Yudhishthir and on the practice of power in ancient India. And it brought to mind my own work on democracy, on the meaning of democracy, which is bandied about, but which is not often really analyzed. And if you look at most countries in the world, they are democracies, whether they are monarchies or so-called people's democracies like North Korea or China, or liberal democracies, and you go on and on. There are only a few enduring monarchies like Saudi Arabia or Brunei, which do not make any pretense at democracy, although they claim that the people is consulted and the people has a say in their policies, which is, of course, something to be reviewed critically. But the fact is that democracy emerged in ancient Greece according to Western historical narrative. And it was not really about all the people. It was about municipalities. As you know, Athens, when it declared itself a democracy after going through various personal dictatorships, Athens then had this system in which the various municipalities which composed the Athenian territory were given a voice in decision-making, policy-making. Now, that was not quite democracy because it was not about all individuals. It was about landed, propertied men. And of course, there were plenty of people who didn't have any say, slaves, but also the so-called metechoi, who were foreigners who perhaps had become naturalized, but were still at a lower had a lower status in society. Anyway, making a long story short, there is a great deal of debate about whether there was real democracy as we understand it today in various parts of the world. India proudly calls itself the mother of democracy. Britain calls itself the mother of parliaments. And democracy, by essence, has to be representative, unless it's a very small community, like a village, in which technically everybody could have a say. But the fact is that human beings have never found it possible to have complete democracy because that means either anarchy or indecision, because to make a decision that carries everybody's approval is almost always impossible. And there is that very old adage, which you find in most civilizations, that democracy, if it exists or if it is, if there is a corresponding word for it in India, Loktantra or Jantantra, is something that comes naturally because, after all, everybody has a say in what happens. No matter what, you cannot go against the majority of the people of a particular community. But power comes from on high, in the sense power cannot be shared beyond a point. And there are famous laws about power which have been written about by a German political philosopher called Michels. And he says, among other things, that power inevitably gets concentrated into fewer and fewer hands until you get one person at the top who pretty much decides everything. Doesn't mean that he doesn't consult people, but he still makes the final decision, because consulting is one thing, but deciding is something which is by nature individual. Trying to have a majority of people making a decision means that the decision will generally be a wrong one, or that it will not be followed with effect. There is that famous American humorist who said that when everybody thinks alike, that means nobody thinks very much. So in order for thought to be developed, it needs to be in the hands of some people who, or at least in the heads of some people who have experience who have proven capability, and who have been brought up in that skill. And that's why Plato wanted philosopher kings. And that's why Aristotle described democracy, but actually decried it. He felt that democracy would not work because in the end, what you would get would be mob power, mob rule. And if you look at the state of many countries in the world today, you find that they are either oligarchies, masquerading politely as democracies. I'm being a little sarcastic, but with nuances, that's pretty much what it amounts to. And you have other countries, on the other hand, which have become ungovernable because too many people are in a position to influence decisions, and very often they just paralyze decisions and they pull in opposite directions, pull and push in opposite directions, and you get the situation in France where power is essentially delegitimized because even though power may be outwardly legal in its operation, there is a strong sense among the majority that it has lost its legitimacy. Why? Because eventually parliaments become rubber stamps, and they are manipulated by forces which are represented by lobbyists. And as you can see, and here again, I'm going to be roughshod, but if you look at the US Congress, it's pretty much made up of lobbyists who are representing diverse interest groups. Regional, economic, ethnic, class groups, class interests, name it as you will. So supposedly that consortium of individual interest or group interest is supposed to make democracy work. But that is less and less obvious if you look at what's happening in most parliaments worldwide. You may remember that in 1968, a lot of the world, particularly Europe, underwent a sort of a mostly non-violent revolution, which was called the famous May 68 movement, which began in France and which spread to many countries. It reflected the unrest in the United States, which had been mostly triggered by the Vietnam War. And by the way, what we have now in Ukraine is a similar instance of a military political event, which may very well lead to a complete reshaping of the global political system and economic system as well. But going back to 1968, one of the qualms raised by many of the agitators, revolutionaries, name them as you will, they were saying that we don't believe in representation, in representative government. We believe in direct participative democracy, which means everybody gets to say what he thinks should be done. Now, in theory, that looks wonderful, but in practice, we all know that it's unmanageable when you are dealing with countries which have millions and millions of members and which have extremely complex social structures. You are not dealing with a village in Amazonia or in Central Africa. You are dealing with huge corporate, political, financial, and managerial systems called regional or national societies, not to mention the international society. And as we all know, many of the branches, many of the constituting members of so-called democratic societies are not democratically ruled. If you look at the army, it's not a democracy. If you look at business management, it's not democratic. It is in the hands of people who are either selected to run companies or who inherited the companies from their families. And you can mention many other instances that are not democratic. One of them being, and this is very topical today, NGOs, because NGOs are non-democratic, but they have become fundamental pieces of today's political systems in so-called advanced countries. So the point where NGOs sort of compel or induce or cajole or pressure governments to make decisions according to their own agendas, whether it's environmental, whether it's based on human rights, whether it's representing minorities like LGBTX and so on. In the end, you get governments and therefore entire societies going by what some unelected NGOs want. And let's put it this way, NGOs are not only not, the leaderships are not elected, but they don't have a well-defined membership. Anybody who is a sympathizer can claim to be a member, and yet they claim to represent the collective will, even if they don't even gather 1% of the population of a country or of a city. They are what we call activists. And activists, by definition, are supposed to be right. So the passive population gets very little say, but the activists get a lot of exposure through the media, and governments hold them to be the representatives of the real democratic will of the people. So that shows you how fraught the question of democracy is, and why no country is in a position to hector and lecture others about becoming more democratic. Because when you think of the Western world wagging its fingers at lots of countries like India and saying you are not really a democracy because you are an authoritarian democracy and Russia is authoritarian, well, excuse me, I can certainly understand that according to its own history, Russia has an authoritarian, let's put it this way, an authoritarian bent of mind collectively. But whether you like it or not, Vladimir Putin has, and this is admitted in the West, has perhaps 70 to 80% approval of its population. Whereas President Macron, who is supposed to be the epitome of democracy in a democratic country, France, probably has less than 30%. And nowadays, they talk about not even 20% people are supporting his policies. So what is democratic and what is authoritarian? And Macron is making decisions without getting approval of parliament. And because he says parliament cannot support him since parliament is too divided and it doesn't have a majority. So he just rules by decree. Whereas Putin has a majority in parliament, which again you will say, oh, well, it's a Russian parliament, it doesn't count. But parliaments have always been very disreputable anyway, because originally they were actually gatherings of wealthy people, mostly lawyers, who bought their seats in parliament. That gave the government a source of funding. And therefore, because those people had bought their seats, they had quite a lot of claims and pretensions. They said, we cannot be manipulated. We have our own views as to what should be done. And they very often opposed the king. As you know, in Britain, they actually ended up executing King Charles I. And in France, they overthrew the king and brought about the revolution. So parliaments were not necessarily popular because they represented vested interests of a minority, and they also opposed the power without having the responsibility because they didn't essentially rule. They just either made laws or refused to accept laws made by the King's Council. So you see, when you look at it, you see the role of today's parliaments, whether it's the US Congress or the British Parliament or the German Bundestag, and you realize that there is a lot of doubt about what you might call the legitimacy or the usefulness of those parliaments. Let's not even talk about the European Parliament, which is known by all to be quite a useless body, generally speaking.
No, now coming to, like you mentioned my book in the beginning, when I was studying Mahabharata and the Loktantra topic comes up in many conversations, like in the topic of Hanuman talking to Bhim, Satyavati talking to Bhishma, and then Bhishma talking to Yudhishthir, like 3 talks I just mentioned. And there's another talk on the Anushasan Parva. There is a lot of conversation there. And the Lokatantra is so different than democracy. First of all, in Lokatantra, a qualified person has to be selected who has been trained from childhood to do these kind of, to do Rajatantra. And the purpose of the society or the rule is also laid out. Now, when I look at democracy word, now democracy just means the rule of the majority. Typically, that is a meaning. But if you look at countries like India and other places where majority has no say generally, it's the minorities who rule the government using democracy. So democracy is somewhere can be easily, like I think, can be corrupted. But if you look at the Lokatantra, and which is not a direct translation of democracy, is somewhere cannot be done that because the power is in the hands of trained people who are determined to make maximum good of the society. Now, there the democracy and Lokatantra differentiation comes in. So when Prime Minister Modi called it the mother of all democracies, how much heartburn it created in the West?
First, I should preface what I'm going to say with the observation that no human institution is perfect.
Correct.
And by itself, perfection means nothing, because perfection means perhaps a mechanical accuracy, which is completely lifeless. So life, by definition, is a constant improvisation, and therefore it cannot even comprehend perfection. But in a practical sense, we all know that the best institutions, the best constitutions, the best mechanisms get corrupted because people are not functioning like well-programmed computers. And if they did, I think the situation would be a lot worse than what we see today, although it's actually coming, because it looks like we're going to entrust more and more decision-making to computers and to artificial intelligence. But once we understand that no institution is perfect and all institutions degenerate because there is entropy, which is a physical principle, so that eventually what you end up with is a caricature of what was originally designed. That's the way it is. So I understand people saying, yes, but what about the alternative to democracy? There isn't any. What about absolute monarchy? What about dictatorship? Those things are terrible. And what about, the way that the Chinese and the North Koreans are ruling themselves? So why are you criticizing democracy? As Churchill said, it is a worse system with the exception of every other. Now, that is a sarcasm, but it is in a way true, because if you can create a balance between the sacredness of power, which has to have spiritual or divine inspiration, and the ability of people to participate in the implementation of decisions after agreeing to them, then you can generate a balance which can last as long as the rulers are true to their word and are honest. The famous Sanskrit dictum, Yato Raja, Tato Praja. I think that works both ways, because a corrupt people cannot easily produce a good ruler, because a good ruler will be overthrown or killed. So people will become corrupt in order to become rulers. On the other hand, a good ruler can really change the people in so many ways. There are many instances of very decadent nations which were in some way regenerated by a very good ruler or set of rulers who were able to bring the best out of their own people by setting an example. So that is a good lesson to keep in mind. And what you are looking at in the Indian context, I'm also reminded of the Sabha Parva in the Mahabharata, and of course of Ramayana as well, and of so many other scriptures. What you see there is a sense of good management for the common good, which is not a demagogical exercise. You are not just trying to gain votes by saying, I'll give you money, I'll give you everything you want, I'll make laws that fit every one of your desires. That's not the role of a good ruler. So the Sabha Parva sets all those examples because Narad Muni explains how a state should be ruled, what are the obligations of the ruler. Closer to, of course, then you have the Arthashastra, which is more perhaps cynical in its analysis. After all, it's a Kali Yuga document, but it is also showing how the ruler, without being bound by the rules that apply to an ordinary person, how the ruler has to set a course which is for the higher purpose of providing safety, prosperity, and tranquility to the population, and keeping the society in balance. These are very high goals, which are not about just fulfilling with the wishes of some section or another of society, or trying to be popular, or saying, I'm just going to do what I think you like, because that way you'll keep me in power, and it doesn't cost me anything anyway, so why don't I just do it for you? I mean, there is a much higher source of inspiration to be kept in mind when you rule a state or a society. And therefore, the collective voices represented by the various councils which were a reality both in Eastern monarchies like India or in Western monarchies. Now, the moment you say monarchy, people get worried. They say, you mean what? A single person ruling? But the fact is that you need to have a symbol which is also an acting symbol at the top of society. Because if you don't have one, eventually there is a vacuum which too many people try to fill, and there is a complete sense of disorientation. I can give you the comparison between Britain and France or Germany, for example. Britain has a king. Let's not comment on the rights and wrongs of the British monarchy, but the fact is that even if there is great turmoil in the political system, and if the prime minister is in trouble, the king remains above the fray, and he's supposed to provide wise counsel and moderate excesses and make sure that nobody becomes a dictator. This has worked for centuries in many countries. And in opposition to that, you have France and Germany, where nobody knows what the hell, who is in charge. And the president very quickly becomes, or the chancellor in Germany becomes discredited. And then people essentially curse him and don't respect him. And they can't wait for him to go. And if they can, they overthrow him. And what you get is very often a politically unstable situation where the leader is changed every 3 months, if it's a parliamentary system, or he has to stay on even if he's a lame duck, like the US president or the French president, and yet he's either impeached or he loses all authority. So you can see why there has to be a spiritual guiding system which inspires the ruler, and the ruler shouldn't ideally just be elected by the manipulation of public opinion, or by getting some party to vote for him by saying, you have to do what I tell you, so you vote for this person, and then basically you'll get some benefits out of that personally. So that is obviously a very lame system, and that's what we have all over the world. So what I see in India today is a very valiant attempt to remain as true as possible to the ethos of the country, while allowing for all the requirements of the current parliamentary democratic system based on universal suffrage. And it's not easy to reach a balance because the Indian constitution was primarily based on Western models. There were some decorative references to the Indian tradition, but let's face it, Baba Saheb Ambedkar was a resolute Westernizer who had studied in America and who felt that most of Indian tradition was anyway corrupted by the caste system. So he refused to acknowledge Hinduism. He felt that the only salvation for India might be to turn to Buddhism, at least what he understood to be Buddhism. And therefore, out of this very Western matrix, the Indian constitution has evolved to a more, let's put it this way, a more indigenous form of governance, but only so far. And as we know, there are very powerful counterbalancing forces, such as the Supreme Court, which can fall under the influence of duly westernized judges who think that the best thing to do is to imitate Britain and America in all their legal dispositions, which, as we know, is highly questionable, especially since in the last few years.
Now, if I do a rapid question round, rapid question hours right now, and I ask you, I'll just ask you a question about the country, and you tell me whether it's a democracy or real not democracy. USA.
Well, I'll tell you that many political analysts today in the West, particularly in Europe, they do not see America as a real democracy. They see it more as an oligarchy, a plutocracy, where the rich have disproportionate power and can influence decisions in any way they want. So the idea that, the American system is a Janus system. Janus is this Roman god who had two faces looking in opposite directions, but it was the same body and it was the same head. So essentially what you have here are the Republicans and the Democrats who claim to represent opposite poles, but who are actually carrying out pretty much the same policies dictated by the financial body, the financial institutions, the Federal Reserve and all the major banks on the one hand, and then a number of political, ethnic, and cultural groups. So I wouldn't call it a democracy, but then again, we still haven't agreed on what a democracy really is, because is a democracy possible? I mean, in the ideal sense, is a democracy something that can ever exist? I am not sure of that.
Like the democracy, the best example is 1908, when the European settlers became more in number than the Native Americans in the East. Then they said yes, elections can happen, and still Native Americans were not allowed to vote. That's an American democracy beginning, and it was purely meant for legalizing the settlement of European settlers, which came through extreme violence to the North America. So to legalize them, that was the whole point of holding elections, actually. Now, coming to UK, is it still a democracy? I call it a monarchy, not democracy.
The UK has always been a monarchy, but it's a very clever system because it contained the democratic aspirations of people by giving them a certain amount of freedom and yet keeping the establishment in place as represented by the king. And of course, the great houses, many of the big business families were brought into the nobility so that they became part of the old ruling system. And therefore, the ruling system kept changing faces, but kept the same essential identity. And that is what kept Britain as a stable country so far. I don't think you can call it a democracy unless you equate democracy with a certain amount of public freedom. If you can go around, of course, that was before COVID and lockdowns, but if you can go around freely, come and go and do as you please, provided you keep certain rules of public decency, then you can say, okay, it's free, so it's democracy. But that was also true of Russia. As long as you don't bother the state, they are not going to bother you. China is a little tighter, but even then, you have a certain freedom to do business and to get rich. The only difference is that there is only one party. So you better be in good terms with the party or join it. You can't just choose between a few parties. So but otherwise, these are all very symbolic representations which countries use to beat on each other. Saying you're not a democracy, I'm a real democracy.
That's a success of American selling campaign about democracy. And so if you look at the Spain, what do you think of Spain?
Spain, of course, the democracy, by the way, was restored thanks to the monarchy, right? This is something which you can acknowledge, even though I must say the Franco regime did a lot of good things and was not a fanatical fascist regime as now they are trying to depict it. It did a lot of good for the country, brought huge amounts of tourism. You can hardly have 30 million tourists in your country if you are going to behave like tyranny, because people will simply go away. So it was, in a way, a successful, stable regime to bring the country back from the brink after the Civil War, which was extremely brutal and destructive. But this being said, Spain has suffered greatly in the last few years because it fell in the hands of incapable people and highly corrupt people. And it also provided probably too much autonomy to its regions. And some of them decided they want to be independent. And of course, that doesn't do any good when the country doesn't see clearly where it's going to go. I mean, if many people think that it may break up, then the stability tends to vanish. And there is a great deal of internal conflict that is generated. So you can see the pitfalls of the concept of democracy when it becomes a form of populocracy, where, whoever, I mean, let's face it, the socialists in Spain today are voted in by the classes of people who have not so much to live on and who therefore expect the government to give them great handouts. And that is what makes the fortune of socialists. But then the fiscal responsibility is not there. And a lot of other required ingredients for capable leadership are also missing. Because in the end, all the socialists, what they do is raise taxes in order to generate some income that they can then distribute among the poorer voters. And they get the country more and more into debt. And as a result, decline accelerates. And before you know it, you are dealing with a bankrupt country where a lot of people are extremely angry and can no longer make ends meet, which is exactly what is happening in Spain.
Portugal?
Portugal is a small country, they have kept themselves out of trouble. Actually, nowadays, some of the so-called left-wing governments are becoming more entrepreneurial and capitalist than others. If you look not only at Portugal, but at Denmark, which is supposed to be ruled by a socialist, a leftist coalition, they are more anti-immigrant and more nationalistic than right-wing parties. And Portugal, when it was under a communist leader, who, by the way, came originally from Goa, so he was an Indian Portuguese, he started giving all those freebies to all the rich foreigners who wanted to come to Portugal and buy property. As long as they invested in the country, they practically paid no taxes. So many countries have followed that recipe of just making it tax-free for rich people and for big companies. And eventually that also generates backlash, because the poor people who have to pay the taxes say, why are you giving all those presents to those foreigners? I can understand where you want to attract money. You have to do the right thing. But it's paradoxical for somebody who claims to be a socialist or a communist to be in that way providing support to the richest people.
So if you look at the African Union, now African Union has opposed Western democracy models a lot. And so in Africa, recently France occupied an island between southern coast of Africa and Madagascar. So, and there is a big thing going on over there. Now people of Africa are questioning, what is the democratic stand of France? What is the colonial stand of France? Now, just to give a twist, now when we say democratic institutions like IMF, World Bank, and other places, so the African Union has been complaining against them of putting them in a perennial debt cycle, just like Chinese. But they prefer Chinese debt over the European or Western debt because of a lot of past mistrust by them. So what is the future of Western democracy in African Union?
The story that you referred to about the island is a very old one, because France has always had these islands. And of course, when Madagascar and other territories occupied by France became independent, they also claimed these islands, which are actually islets, very small pieces of land in the ocean. And France, for strategic reasons, refused to give it back to them, claiming that this was not part of the deal, and France wanted to keep a presence in the Indian Ocean. Everybody now wants to be in the Indian Ocean. So they definitely held on to those islands against the will of neighboring states. The question is that the West only gave up its colonies after working out establishing a system which would ensure that they would remain in debt, dependent to the West, and that they would have to buy all their manufactured goods from the West, and they would supply raw materials at low prices. That was the deal for decolonization to take place. It was cheaper than fighting on armed rebellions in those territories. So I think Africans who have long had their own, what you might call tribal systems of governance, they never took to democracy. They actually went through the motions because they had to satisfy the Western powers that, you have to be democratic, otherwise we won't like you, which anyway was a very hypocritical statement, because we all know that the West dealt very happily with dictators in many parts of Africa and preferred them to instability. So the Africans, again, have only gone along with the leading powers because everybody had to. But I have a feeling, in fact, it's not only a feeling, it's drawn from experience in history, that the moment the Western countries lose their predominance, their systems will suffer. They will have to change their own democratic models of governance. And likewise, all over the world, many countries will drop democracy if they ever practiced it, but at least they will drop the pretense of democracy, and they'll adjust to what they are used to or what they can come up with. I think the Chinese and Russian policy in this regard, which is realistic, is we deal with countries with whatever government they have. We don't try to change it. We don't tell them you should change it, because it's for people to decide. And who are the people to decide? Most people don't really decide anything, nor do they even want do they ever want to decide because they don't know what they should decide. So the whole idea that you have to give the people a voice and all is it sounds very good, but in fact people don't have a voice. They have as many voices as there are individuals, and you can't really make much out of that. So my view is that the Western model only lasted as long as it was powerful enough to impose itself. And if you look at history, monarchies have been far, far longer lived than democracies. Democracies generally survived for a few decades and then eventually collapsed. I mean, I can give you the example of the Roman state, the Greek republics, which were absorbed by Alexander's empire, by the Macedonian Empire, and so on and so forth. So, we can all be optimistic and say, eventually everybody will rule himself and so on and so forth. But in fact, governments are the product of circumstances and conditions, just like states were generally created by certain people through wars. They didn't come about spontaneously. And that's the way it is. And then history creates a heritage, and that heritage is what nations in some way keep. So I think most countries will eventually rule themselves in the way that they have been used to ruling themselves for many centuries.
The last question, like suppose if the Asian countries start setting up military bases all around Europe and all around USA, will the Indian Ocean is become the key point, strategic posture for West. What about Atlantic and Pacific becoming strategic posture for the Asian large countries like India and China and then Russia? What do you think is going to happen to the Western democratic model?
That's already happening, by the way. As you know, China is steadily expanding its footprint into the Pacific and openly challenging the US, saying you have no more right to be here than we do. And Russia is also, in fact, in dialogue with India, also using the port of Vladivostok to once again extend its reach in the Pacific. So clearly, non-Western countries are also furthering their interest by developing a presence. And inevitably, when you have developed enough business interests in a region, you want to protect those interests by creating a military presence, by establishing a military presence. That's a simple fact of geopolitics. So I think the Western model will definitely evolve towards more authoritarianism. There is no question that you see Western countries are losing the veneer of democracy, and they're essentially telling people, shut up, this has to be done, whether it's for health reasons or for economic reasons or for environmental reasons. That's a new bugaboo now. You have to do this because otherwise the planet will die. So it's a very compelling reason, and most people readily agree to it. But the fact is that as a result of these things, you will find more and more authoritarianism coming down on most of us, it's true. And people will generally accept it, at least for a while, because they will feel that there is a necessity, whether it's economic or environmental. And therefore, I certainly don't see the Western model surviving. I mean, as you know, many people are now openly talking and writing about the US breaking up. And then who knows what would become of some of those states if they decide, Republican states, or even Democrat states, that we are going to have more power at the seat of government here because we need to put people under some control. So, this is all on the way, and we can change it. It's like geological events, they happen, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and all. There's nothing you can do about it. Eventually it goes on. Fortunately, we have times of calm, and we have to hope that we will experience some more of those times of relative calmness.
Thank you so much, Com. And for the viewers, and this is one of the most, the democracy word has been overused now. Like, I feel that it's been overused. And also there are many Indian saints who have called democracy as demon crazy also. And there are many such instances. Lokatantra was kind of a, you can say, a rule by an intelligent people, not by anybody. And even today that happens because the rule is always done by powerful few people, whether they elected on the basis of money or on the basis of their qualities. So that's the decision. That's the only difference comes in between the Lokatantra and democracy. But democracy, the American selling of democracy has made democracy word itself unsellable, because now people think of it's no longer as working. It just gives a tool in the hands of the American or other Western agencies to interfere freely in the economies or the politics of the countries which practice democracy. Now, do you want to add anything to it, Com?
I would say that the power or the exercise of power is like medicine or engineering. It's a craft. You have to know what you are doing. You have to be trained. That's why traditionally most people inherited their jobs from their parents and their families, because they were expected to do better than others who would not have any real preparation for those jobs. That doesn't mean you cannot have outsiders coming in, being trained and becoming even better than those who have inherited it. But this has to be a slow selection process. And if you look at the British system, about which we can say a lot of very negative things, still the British system had succeeded in training people who were not necessarily from the top of society, but who acquired the skills by going under some sort of tutorship. And that's how you had relatively good prime ministers. I'm not talking about the world, but I'm talking about the interest of Britain, or at least the ruling class of Britain, who were not necessarily from the top, Lloyd George or, Gladstone, or even Disraeli. They were people who essentially became part of the ruling class and they learned their skill. Now what we have is, in many countries of the world, is people who are just coming through the game of elections and patronage, and they are not prepared. And that's why if you look at the Western, especially the European politicians, and not to mention the Americans, they're a bunch of adolescents. They're really people who have no clue. They think that by looking good and doing and saying the right thing, they can make a successful essentially have a successful exercise of power. On the other hand, if you look at Prime Minister Modi, among others, he had a very long training at many levels. And that has given him a particular understanding and knowledge of both India and eventually of the way the world works as well. So that's something to be recognized.
Thank you so much. And for all the viewers who are watching it for the first time or seen for the first time, do like, share, subscribe to the show, and let us know your feedback. Your comments are very important. Namaste.
Namaskar.